the heart of the city which gave us the greatest band of them all is the underground cellar where it all began.
The Cavern was the making of the Beatles, and the Beatles were the making of the Cavern.
This is the story of the most famous club in the world.
As I walked towards the Cavern, the beat actually hit me in the heart.
An iconic venue whose fame couldn't save it from demolition.
You couldn't believe it. The Cavern would have been in America. It would have been a shrine.
A place where a host of legends have performed.
Playing the Cavern was quite special for us.
But whose name will always be best remembered as the birthplace of the Beatles.
To see the Beatles, it was just skull-shattering.
You could lean across and touch them.
We'd seen Elvis, but that was the movies, that was America, that was another world. This was ours, this was on our doorstep in my hometown.
February the 9th, 2011, marks the 50th anniversary of the day that a band with no record contract and not many fans pulled up into Liverpool's Matthew Street, gingerly descended the 18 steps into a sweaty, smelly cellar and played the Cavern for the very first time. Over the next 2.5 years, the Beatles would tread the cramped Cavern stage nearly 300 times. By the time they finally said goodbye to the place, Beatlemania had swept Britain and the Fab Four were about to conquer the planet.
We count ourselves lucky because for, 7 pence as it were, you could not only see the Beatles but hear them sing as well.
The Cavern is a crucial part of the legend of the 4 Liverpool lads who shook the world. But what was it like to witness history in the making?
I came down here and never seen anything like it in my life. I'm in town and, this is the den of iniquity, my mum used to call it.
It was hot and sweaty and very dark. I mean, you didn't have,
It was a death trap, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it was a sweaty place, but that's what rock and roll was about in those days. That's why we loved it.
The very first thing that would hit me when I went to the Cavern was probably the smell.
It was this mixture of rotting fruit from the warehouses above upstairs, urine from the toilets, which weren't the best in the world.
Smoke, the hot dogs, and the disinfectant they threw down the next day to get rid of the smell.
Whenever I think of the Cavern, I never think of how great the kids were, how good the sound wasn't. Mention the Cavern and I immediately think, nettle.
And the smell lingered on your clothes. You'd be on a bus going home and then somebody would get up and sit in front of you and you just go like that and you go, she's been the Cavern.
There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed.
The Cavern started out as a Victorian fruit warehouse and served as an air raid shelter during the war, before opening as a jazz club in 1957.
All these places have their moments.
The Quarrymen, a skiffle band formed by a teenage John Lennon, played there in this early incarnation.
Because skiffle come out of jazz, they sort of tolerated skiffle.
Yeah, it was regarded as a form of jazz, so it was tolerated in the Cavern.
But it was in 1961, by which time the Quarrymen had evolved into the Beatles and the Cavern had become a rock and roll hotbed, that this basement in a Liverpool backstreet started to become a place where people's lives could change forever.
The first time we came down to see another band called Dale Roberts and the Jaywalkers, because we heard that he could sing like Cliff Richard and the band could play like the Shadows. So we saw them, and when we got up to get out, they said, this other band's coming on now called the Beatles.
They didn't speak when they came on, they just started singing straight away. He was so loud and the whole sound was so different.
And the Beatles came on, and I wanted to be in that band. I wanted to be in a band like them. I wanted to play here.
They were such a hard, driving, virile kind of force on a stage, you know, and that was very attractive to everybody who saw it.
Early 60s Liverpool was awash with hopeful young groups playing American cover versions. But almost instantly, the firm favourites of the Cavern regulars were the scruffy quartet with a terrible pun in their band name and no obvious lead singer.
A lot of the people who came, if they didn't like George, it didn't matter, because they liked Paul. And if they didn't like Paul, they would like John. And if they didn't like John, they would like George. You know, it was 3 lead singers.
Lennon's voice, I remember particularly, that pleading voice, Dizzy Dizzy Miss Lizzie, which he just sort of tore apart as a song, really.
John, very sort of sarcastic, tongue-in-cheek, but friendly. Paul was, as ever, PR man of the group, would be fluttering his eyelashes at all the girls.
Even though John was the leader on stage and cracking gags and things like that, Paul was really the singer. He could do all Little Richard songs.
Well, a song to John with Paul hitting Sally. He saw Mary coming and they thought they gave me.
To hear Paul rip into Long Tall Sally and stuff like that, you know, I think, geez, where did that voice come from?
And completing the classic early Cavern era Beatles lineup of John, Paul, George and Pete. Mean, moody, magnificent, Pete Best.
I mean, he was a hell of a loud bass drummer, and he just used to lock in with McCartney's bass.
The sound that they had, Pete was very, very crucial to that sound. And that was the sound that made them so popular here.
He was moody, he didn't speak, he didn't ever say anything. He was just shy, wasn't he? He was shy. He sort of looked down under his eyes at you and always lovely.
It was definitely a James Dean situation, you know, where girls would just wait for him to smile, and he never did.
In those days, I had to crank out a solid beat. If the girls were trying to make me smile, you know, it was... I had my head down, I'm concentrating on what I'm doing. Now and again I give a little grin.
A special bond was formed between the 4 Beatles and the teenagers paying to see them. And that was cemented in the informal atmosphere of the now legendary Cavern lunchtime sessions.
And it was great because the kids would come from work in the lunch break, come down here and have a hot dog and a Coke.
So,
They played 2 spots. It was 12 to 1, and then 1:15 to 2:15. And the best spot was the second spot. So I always tried to get my lunch a little bit late.
And I would run from where I worked and got down here, watched the show, tried to hang around as long as I could at the end, have a chat at the coffee bar at the back.
And it was very, very relaxed because you could just shout up to them and ask them to play different numbers, and they messed about on stage.
Money don't get everything it's due.
The thing about the Cavern was because it was a small place, because it was where the in crowd used to go. All the same people used to go there all the time.
I reckon I must have seen the Beatles maybe 100, 150 times.
The interaction with the fans, they would chat, they knew everyone's name.
You really did know that you were watching history being made. You knew that something incredible was going to have to happen. You didn't know then that it was going to be something that was going to touch the whole of the world and change things forever.
The Merseybeat scene was about to explode.
There were 350 groups, and the Cavern, this became their temple, their holy of holies.
But some would be left behind.
The reality of the situation hit me. Good God, I'm no longer with the band.
That's what I want.